challenging, son.
Welcome back to another episode of Off the Shelf. My name's Ryan, and today we're going to be talking about an interesting new book that just came out, The Comic Book Story of Basketball, A Fast Break History of Hoops, by Fred Van Lente and Joe Cooper. Anybody that knows me knows I am a huge basketball fan. I have been since, as long as I can remember, going back to when Jordan was on the Bulls. I think I've watched every single championship season that they played. As I got older, the incoming of Shaq and Kobe to the Lakers, even before that, when Nick Van Exel, Eddie Jones, and stuff like that. But that's, I could go for days. This is the perfect book for me. And when 10 Speed Press reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to check it out, do a little bit of coverage on it, I jumped at the chance. And they were kind enough to send me a hard copy of the book. I read it last night going into today and finished it off today, and I absolutely loved it. There's stuff that I didn't know. There's stuff that I did know. Obviously, it's only 176 pages, so they could only put so much, but I think it's a pretty complete overview of the history of basketball and its creation, and, highlighting some of the players that have played this amazing sport. I wanted to just talk about some of the highlights that I really enjoyed from the book, in hopes that maybe some of you guys might pick it up. Maybe anybody that likes basketball, I think that this is definitely a book you will enjoy. So as I said, Fred Van Lente is the author, Joe Cooper on art, colored by Dave Swartz, lettering by Fred Van Lente as well. 10 Speed Press is the. You got the hardwood court for the table of contents. And I love the title of the first chapter, is called Murder Ball. It talks about the beginning of basketball and how it was created and why it was created. And it started during a harsh New England winter in December of 1891. Young men there were, acting out, and there, we had somebody trying to figure out what to do with them to keep them busy. Dr. James Naismith was the one that came up with it. First go at it wasn't exactly what he imagined. We see fighting going on, blood going on, so he comes up with rules for his sport. And this is Naismith's first rules. I thought this was kind of interesting because it's played completely different than we know it as today. So it's very interesting to see the breakdown of how, once you had the ball, you could not move. I think that's pretty interesting. And then it talks about how fouling and how you can't punch the ball, and even in the beginning it was a basket. It had a bottom in it, so you literally had to, every time somebody made a basket, you had to pop it out again so you could continue playing. And I love this. It even talks about how the janitor had to be summoned with his ladder to fish the ball after each field goal. And we see here too that the women there are wondering what they're doing. The person that comes to see is Maud Sherman, who would become the Mrs. Inventor of basketball just 3 years later. And it talks about the growth of the sport and how it grew so exponentially, so quick. And we see the women having to play in private because they were playing in their undergarments and the men couldn't be allowed to see them. And then we meet Clara Bear, who was a phys ed instructor, and she wrote to Naismith about about basketball after she discovered it in a magazine. He replied with a rough diagram showing what he believed to be the ideal positioning for players on the court. These positions weren't, as it says at the top, they're not all that different from the ones we know today. We have the center, power forward, shooting guard, point guard, small forward. And then obviously we have some of the NBA greats. We got and these are what our ESPN.com ranks as the number one in their positions. We got Tim Duncan from the San Antonio Spurs as power forward. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the top center. Michael Jordan, leading shooting guard. LeBron James, top small forward. And Magic Johnson as the all-time point guard. And this book will continue to talk about them later as we go forward. Skipping ahead, I think it's interesting that they were playing in cages in the beginning. That was an interesting little thing that I didn't know that was happening at one point. And this talks about the first true professional league, the American Basketball League, the ABL, formed in 1925, which banned cages and dribbling. As it says, the hardcore fans found that too tame, and the ABL struggled to find an audience and folded after only 6 years of play. Invented only 13 years prior, it was so popular that it ended up making its way into the Olympics. And it talks about how the Germans were the initial winners of those games, and a term called barnstorming, where they coined by touring theater troops who went from town to town in rapid fire fashion, performing in any barn that would host them. And it even shows over their 29 seasons, they were 792 and 86, which is an 8.9 winning percentage, which I thought was kind of crazy. They even had an 111 straight games winning streak. Then we see the father of black basketball, Robert L. Douglas, who was a hotel bellhop in Manhattan when a friend invited him to watch the game, and it was love at first sight. And we see Bob Douglas setting up. He recruited some of the best black players and coaches he could find for the first pro team entirely owned and coached by African Americans. And he named the team the New York Renaissance, or the Wrens for short. And they'd play in ballrooms. But the racism was still, racism was still a thing back then. And it would be some time before black players and white players would be on the same team and would be accepted. And as I said, like with the racism, we see these are the original Celtics, the New York Celtics, not the Boston Celtics that we all know. And I love this scene right here. In Jim Crow Louisville, rather than the typical handshake between teams before the games, the Celtics' best player, Joe Lapchick, hugged and kissed the Wrens' Tarzan Cooper. But people weren't ready for that kind of stuff, and the Wrens had to be whisked away from the venue in a paddy wagon for their own safety. So this is like way back in the day, and to see something like that, to learn that something like that happened, is actually pretty fucking cool. Learning about the Harlem Globetrotters. They even played against professional sports teams, but that didn't last, and now it's more of a lot of people consider it more something that's scripted, kind of like a pro wrestling a little bit. Talks about how the pro basketball league was kind of hard to get going, considering that you could watch for amateur game for free everywhere. And at this time that was trying to go on, we also meet Babe Didrikson, who was one of the first female basketball players that went on to do stuff professionally, even getting into the Olympics and winning 2 gold medals and 1 silver in hurdles. The cool thing about her is that she didn't conform to anybody's stereotypes and was even less so a role model. And she quit the Cyclones, the team that she was on, when she was accused of being paid by Chrysler to promote a car. And then ended up going on to being a professional golfer and playing tennis as well, so that she could become as rich as she wanted. As we move forward, there was gambling going on in college basketball, which was soon earned the reputation of the slot machine of sports. And you even had some of the professional or some of the college guys, when they would work summer jobs in the Catskill Mountains as waiters, they called it the Borscht Belt League, which is where some of like the illegal gambling was going on, and they would play for money over there. And this is the rise of professional basketball. We see that the fall from the point shaving scandal was so bad that Madison Square Garden considered dropping basketball altogether. And this is the birth of the New York Knickerbockers, aka the New York Knicks. And they attempted to start, and they were one of the founding franchises of the latest attempt at starting a pro basketball league, which was the BAA, Basketball Association of America. And at this time as well, moving forward, the BAA and NBL ended up merging into the National Basketball Association as we know it now. And it even notes how the NBA logo is based on a photo of Lakers legend Jerry West. This is Red Auerbach, one of the most winning coaches in NBA history. He was the coach of the Celtics, which is the biggest Lakers rivalry. Not a huge Celtics fan myself, but that's besides the point. Talks about his coaching style and how he liked to manipulate the clock in other ways, especially after the shot clock was invented, because people would just stand around with the ball, and it would take forever for plays to go through. And I thought this was pretty interesting, learning about why the shot clock was invented as well. Meet the great Bill Russell, who won 11 championships during his dominating era during 57 and 69. And as we move forward here, too, we see the defection of Wilt Chamberlain from the Harlem Globetrotters. And we see how, after he left the NCAA, they outlawed 3 of his personal specialties, which was taking off from the foul line and dunking free throws, goaltending, and lobbing inbound passes from the baseline over the backboard to sink them. Talking about how Wilt joined the Philadelphia Warriors and became the arch nemesis of Celtics legend Bill Russell. We meet a young Lou Alcindor, a.k.a. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And it talks about how effective he was at dunking that they banned it right before his junior year. And it quickly became known as the Lou Alcindor rule. And so he learns another way, and this is where the skyhook is invented during his time at UCLA. A new league is trying to be formed called the ABA, which is where we end up seeing some of the other teams that will be consolidated into the NBA over time. What was interesting too about the ABA is that they used a white, red, and blue ball, and it was more of a spectacle than what people were seeing in the NBA. As Lou Alcindor, aka Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, is being lured to the ABA, the Milwaukee Bucks make him a better offer, and he goes on to dominate there. Fast forward, we see Dr. J with the New York Nets. See his famous Iron Cross move. Some of his other famous dunks. This was a page that I really loved. Dr. J in the air doing his thing. As we move forward, we see that the NBA buys out the ABA. And then this was pretty cool, too, to kind of see where these franchises started. This is the NBL franchises and where they ended up and their many transformations. The BAA franchises, the ABA franchises. And like you'll notice, like Syracuse Nationals became the 76ers. Denver used to be the Rockets and now the Nuggets. The Warriors used to be in Philadelphia and eventually became the Golden State Warriors. Then we continue to see the expansion franchises. And now it goes forward to talk more about the women and coming into and forming their own leagues and how they were constantly like kind of pushed to the back burner and not taken as seriously, which is I think we're starting to see less of that now as the years are going by, but we're seeing, some of these women who are just as good, if not better, than some of the men that are playing in the league. And as we move forward, we meet Larry Bird, who many called the Great White Hope, as well as the same time as he's coming up, we meet the Great Magic Johnson. They battle it out in college, and that leads even more so into the NBA. And it's just cool to kind of see. It's cool to kind of see, like, through this lens, just a compressed history of the league and where it started and all the way to where it goes, and to see these highlights of now as we get forward, to see some of the highlights of the eras that I really enjoyed. And it talks about the domination of the Lakers and how Jerry Buss started bringing in movie stars, and we got Jack Nicholson right there sitting in the sidelines. We got Jerry Buss, calling it the Showtime era of the Lakers. See the incoming of Commissioner the late great David Stern, and how he helped grow the league. Seeing the rivalry of the Lakers and Celtics reignited this time between Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. Again, seeing some of the stuff that happened between them, like just the little tidbits that I didn't know, small little, facts that really make this book interesting, and definitely recommend this to anybody that's a fan of basketball, even if you're not a comic book fan. Like this this is just a cool way to kind of learn a consolidated history of the NBA, and we see when we learn about like the beginning of the decline for Larry Bird when he injures his back. See the when Magic Johnson got diagnosed with HIV, and just this moment right here between them when he tells Larry about what happened, and they ended up playing as rivals, but at the end they became really close friends. See the history of when the Olympics finally allowed the professionals to play in the Olympics, and the Dream Team in 1992. See the oncoming of who many call the GOAT, Michael Jordan, what he meant to the league, and how he kind of changed, and he came into the league and he changed it, starting with his revolutionary new basketball shoe, and just becoming so much bigger than the sport itself, and helped really propel the sport into what we know it is today. Talking about an instance which I didn't know about, somebody killing a 17-year-old to jack him for his Jordans, and how that affected Michael. Hearing about that stuff, and we see him he takes out Magic Johnson to win that first ring, goes on to win that second ring, that third ring, then he retires, goes and plays baseball, then he decides to come back, and right here, kind of cool to talk about the Space Jam movie he did, and then we see the incoming of Shaquille O'Neal during Michael's absence. And Michael comes back, wins 4, 5, and 6, and many thought, like, what do we do after Michael retired again for a second? How is the league going to last with its biggest star gone? And we even talks about how, like, the decline of the ratings of the finals after the year after he left, and it briefly talks about how Michael came back to play for the Wizards and donated his entire salary to the victims of the September 11th attacks. And the conversation of who the GOAT is, saying that no matter what, that pretty much you can tell what Fred VanVleet's opinion is, that Michael's a GOAT, because he says that no matter who will come, it's more than stats, it's what he did for the league. Talks about talks about the history of basketball in China, and how it became as big as it did there. We got Yao Ming, talks about that as well. And then during this, it's also talking about how the European players come over and start becoming a force in the NBA as well. This is probably one of my favorite pages. We talk about the teaming up of Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, even where talking about how he nicknamed himself the Black Mamba after watching Kill Bill by Quentin Tarantino, and how the sub-Saharan snake is notorious for its ability to strike accurately at maximum speed and rapid succession, much like Kobe on the. Kobe's my favorite basketball player of all time. This book was actually written prior to his passing, so it doesn't mention it. But just reading this, and like every time I think about Kobe, it kind of chokes me up, because he was an important part of almost my entire life, being such a huge basketball fan, and I admired him for more than just stuff he did on the court. It was what he did off the court as well. That talks about the work that Kobe did overseas, starting a basketball training camp in China. As we go forward, we're seeing the women's league take place again, and what ends up happening is the WNBA is formed, and actually the WNBA is quite young compared to other sports leagues, and continues to grow each year. Like I said, some of the most talented athletes are on the WNBA, and I thought this was cool because I didn't really realize that that's when it formed. Was then I was just 11 years old. I wasn't paying attention to that stuff, but it's kind of cool to see how that took place. Even seeing this, a young Becky Harmon, who was a basketball player, and she injures herself, and she's develops a relationship with Greg Popovich, and now she's even an assistant coach on the San Antonio Spurs. Fast forward, starts talking about LeBron. Now, some of this history I don't need to really go into anymore, but obviously talks about his decision to leave Cleveland, and then how he came back. And I love the way he ends this with just the swish. Now, No, this may not be for all of you, but if you like basketball, if you like comics, I recommend it, man. They also 10 Speed Press puts out some great content. They also have the comic book story of professional wrestling. They have the Frederick Douglass book by David Walker. David Walker's also got another book by 10 Speed Press coming out in January about the Black Panther Party. So highly recommend it. And make sure that you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Comic Lounge. Make sure you throw your comments or suggestions down below. Or email us, thecomicloungepod@gmail.com. And make sure you hit the subscribe button so you're notified every time we put up a new one, and hit new video, and hit the bell icon as well. And on that note, I'm out.